Okay, go live. I'll try to mute myself when I cough. Done. Okay, we're live. It says live. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Richard Sylvester and Tim Freke chatting non-duality. And I just happen to have both of their books here, Soul Story from Tim Freke and Confessions of a Seeker from Richard Sylvester. So those are their latest books. And maybe just give you both an opportunity to any plugs or anything you want to mention at the beginning about what you have. Yeah, anything coming up, talks, retreats, books, anything.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Tim, why don't you go first?
I've since you've invited me, Walter, I actually have. I don't do them very often now, but we have a retreat which we've run every year over New Year, and it's a beautiful time to go deep. So we run it on the 30th, 31st, and the 1st, and it's in Glastonbury, UK, and there are still a few places left. And I think it's a way of bringing, you will not forget it, that's for sure.
And Richard.
Yes, in January there should be in-person London meetings and possibly some Zoom meetings coming up in the new year. It's a long time since I've done a Zoom meeting, and the only other plug is that excellent book that Walter just held up, Confessions of a Seeker. That is my confession of 30 or more years spent, well spent or misspent, I'm not quite sure which, as a spiritual seeker following many paths, but it's got quite a lot more in it than that as well. A bit of stuff on consciousness and quite a lot of stuff about religion. So, and a few readers have thought that it was very funny as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, actually, I'm one of them.
The other thing to mention perhaps at the start is actually I do the stuff online every week with a little group of people who are interested. I'll do it later tonight on every Sunday. So that's a regular connection I love.
Excellent. Oh, and Richard, did you hit the record button on your end there?
I did, and it tells
okay.
So
we're all recording. Great. So this will be available to watch on any of our 3 channels. So it'll be out there, and it's out there now. So I thought just to get started, maybe Tim could share, and Richard, as to the origins of this. I don't know if I should call it a debate. I mean, it's a conversation, but I think there are some critiques of perhaps the others' teachings or message or something to that effect. So maybe Tim could clarify that for the folks at home.
Well, I think the origin probably was that I got to see Richard, who I hadn't had the chance to talk to for very many years. And as the older I get, the more I kind of, I think it's being too influenced by Socrates, really. I'm just fascinated by what people believe, how well it holds together, and how they've ended up there. And so I just found myself asking questions. And I think what really happened with Richard and I was I just asked a lot of questions. And then when there's an answer, there's usually another question. And when there's an answer, there's usually another question to try and get to the real hub of what's actually where Richard had got to since the last time I saw him, and was aware that where I'd ended up was quite different to the last time that I saw him. And that led to a conversation. And then from what I heard, Richard said, later that it was a shame it wasn't filmed, and would I take part in a conversation with you online? And here I am.
Fantastic. Anything you'd like to add to that, Richard?
Yeah, that's absolutely the genesis of this meeting, I think. I met Tim in Glastonbury at the wonderful Blue Note Cafe, and there was a session in which I would say he questioned me pretty intensely about my take on non-duality. And then when he left, Dawn Garland was also there. And when he left, almost the first thing, or one of the first things that I said to Dawn, I turned to her and said it was a real shame that we did not have the video camera with us, because I feel it would have made a very sort of exciting live event. I think the phrase non-duality cage fighting might have quickly passed through my mind. I'm not too sure. And so this, obviously it's not the same, but this seemed to be about as good as we could get if we set this up and just see how it went. And hopefully it may be interesting to some people, because, you know, I think we have different views that will become apparent if it's not already so. And so let's just see where it goes.
Fantastic. And so we're live on YouTube. Anyone that has a question, just type in question and then your question. That'll help me, because sometimes people on YouTube, they argue amongst each other and there are random comments. And just to help me sift through that, just type in question, then your question, and I'll read it out loud anonymously and make it a part of the show. But my first question was about this. I remember listening to Tim say that Nisargadatta's statement about you are not a person, and this whole idea of no self. And that to me was pretty powerful. But I'm also hearing that it can have some destabilizing, depersonalization, loss of interest. And when that is heard, I don't know how to say it in the wrong way, or maybe people are being gaslit into thinking they're not a person. I don't know what's going on, but I think that meant a lot to you, at least at one point. And so maybe you could tell us about how you feel about this no self.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first, I just want to say how much I'm enjoying the fact that as I'm looking here at Richard, coming out of his head is a copy of I Am That by Nisargadatta, which was the very book which definitely led to that. So I came across I Am That when it wasn't available in this country, only in India. I had to send away for it. And then bought it for all my friends because I just blew my mind. So this is in my 20s. And there was one phrase where he says, you've confined yourself to the size of a body and the span of a lifetime. Undeceive yourself and be free. You are not a person. And the line, you are not a person, seems such an outrageous statement at the time. I felt like he'd nailed me to the floor, because it was a fundamental assumption that I was a person. And there's this guy going, you're not a person. And that led me to a particular experience on the journey where I was actually a musician at the time. I was running a recording studio. We were recording me in the studio. There was a glitch. The music was just going round on a loop. And I started repeating, I am not a person. I'm not a person, to this rhythm. And then suddenly I wasn't. And it was an extraordinary experience that headed me off to India and all sorts. So the thing that's changed for me, Walter, is that I think that experience was really important for me. It was very interesting. But what was interesting what is notable looking back is that it came with an interpretation which I had got from Nisargadatta and then from the other non-dual teachers I was exploring with. And what's happened to me over the last 10 years, maybe a bit more, is that I've come to a lot of ideas have turned around. So now when I look at the experience, I still see it as important. I still see it as interesting, but I don't see it. I don't understand it in the way that I did. And that's been a major shift. And that's because I won't go into them now because I want a conversation, but there's been a shift in my understanding of the nature of consciousness. That's been fundamental. There's been a shift in my understanding of what you could call epistemology, how we know things, from this idea that you just know, rather than it's kind of that somehow there's a direct knowing, which is not to do with ideas, and that therefore non-dual experiences are self-validating. They are, You don't need to interpret them. They interpret themselves, all of which now I think is epistemologically naive. And that's led to a reevaluation of how we understand identity, and the nature of what we mean by things like the self. And just to start us off here, just because it's not, I come across a lot of people who have been psychologically damaged by non-duality, but I haven't been at all. And also, in fairness, people can, I meet people who've had the same thing with Christianity or with Buddhism, or there's it's possible to find the dark place in anything. So I'm not here to attack it as somehow a bad thing, merely to say, oh, I saw it like this, and now that doesn't seem good enough anymore. And now I see it like this, and it feels a lot, if it not feels, it just is for me an awful lot better and more coherent, and leads to a more interesting experience.
Thank you. Richard, anything about no self and you're not a person, or responding to anything Tim had to say there?
Well, I'll start with Nisargadatta. I think the title, I am that. I love the title. I think it just, sums everything up in a way that I might be here to talk about. And, in a way I could shut down at this moment and just leave it at that. I am that. It's a sort of perfect expression. As to the book, I read it a long time ago. I think it's very confusing. I think it's contradictory in parts, and I think it's got wonderful things in it as well. So, that would be my starting point with that. For me, I suppose in a way my response comes from a kind of, a very deep sense that I'm looking for the word, I think I used the word addiction. I was going to say the word interest, but the word addiction, when it fell upon me, of non-duality, even though I understood very little about it, in a way, it was stunningly obvious that it had nothing to do with me. I mean, I'd been a passionate spiritual seeker for many years. I'd followed gurus, I'd done innumerable techniques, I'd been involved in transpersonal psychotherapies. I was a trainer, and I trained people in transpersonal approaches to counseling and therapy. I was very, very, very deeply involved. I came across non-duality. I won't go into the story of how it involved a few coincidences, but I've talked about it other places. And I think I could say I came away from my first encounter experiencing an incredibly deep yawn. It was actually a meeting with Tony Parsons. I quite liked Tony, but I had absolutely no interest in what he was saying. And also, I would say probably zero understanding of it as well. I thought, oh, well, that was a nice afternoon out. I won't do that again. And then the second time I came across it, which was probably 2 or 3 years later, and again, it was a meeting of Tony Parsons that I'd been persuaded to go along to by some nice people on the kind of promise that there'd be drinking and eating and partying afterwards. So I thought, well, it's worth sitting through this dreary nonsense for that. And so I went along, and I just can't explain it. I still didn't understand anything about it, but I was completely hooked on a level which clearly had very little to do with the mind. And I just stayed hooked, and I also stayed uncomprehending for a long time. A lot of what was said made me angry, and I'd ask lots and lots of questions, and then I'd go away and feel angry again. And this just went on for a long time. I can't explain what the addiction was. Clearly on some, and I think I mean it both in the way that non-dual speakers often say, when they say it clearly, obviously had nothing to do with me, but I also mean that on a kind of more normal psychological and characterological basis, that it kind of really had nothing to do with me. And, I just kind of went on like that until that stopped. And here we are now. And there was kind of stuff in between those two apparent points in time, which I'm not going to bore you with right now. As to what Tim said, I think one of our problems is, you see, I think that Tim is approaching this, from a philosophical perspective, from an analysis of language, of thought, ideas, etc., etc., etc. And I'm not.
No, I think that's completely wrong, Richard.
Okay, well, so
I think that's completely wrong. I think that is a caricature of it. I think, because the experiential, I mean, I've just talked about an experience. The experiential journey has been absolutely the center for me. The question then becomes, how do you understand the experiences you're having? Do you just accept the way that they're portrayed to you by the person that you happen to be listening to? Because that's what I see happening a lot. I see people convinced they're having a non-conceptual, non-ideational experience, which they are actually having. They're having a totally ideational experience. They're convinced they're not, because they're not reflective enough to notice. So they are having they have been talked into a way of seeing something that they think is self-evident. So the whole transformation for me in this area came when I realized I did that for years. And when I looked at what is arguably, I think, my best book, Lucid Living, because it's so short and concise, in which I laid out my approach to oneness or non-duality. It's still not quite non-duality, but it's close enough. And realized that I was presenting it as if I had these arguments. I thought they were great. Well, not arguments, they're pointing out exercises, that bang, I've got it, as if there was nothing, the mind wasn't involved, like you said, but it was. It's just I wasn't reflective enough to see that. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And what's astonished me is how difficult it is for people to see it. Because once you see it, it's absolutely obvious. And I can give you examples that I've done. I'm not saying you've done this, but I have done through the years, which were not obvious to me, where I felt I was revealing something self-evident, but it wasn't. It actually wasn't. It was actually being, that people were being fed into it. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. It could still be right. It just means let's acknowledge that. Let's get rid of this other view that somehow it's in a different ballpark, because it's not.
Okay, so what first comes to me about that is that I would never sit here and say, that I, for example, could give people experience of this, could take people through exercises, which would lead them to this. I mean, that's the sort of thing that I used to do many, many years ago. As I said, I was involved in the transpersonal psychology movement. I was involved as a trainer. The kind of workshops that you do, which I think you describe as big love. I was involved in many workshops like that, both as a participant and as a workshop leader as well. I don't see any of that as having any relevance whatsoever to what I'm talking about. And it does make me wonder whether, in a way, we are talking about the same thing or not. I mean, I don't know, and I'm not even sure how that, or even if it's important, that it could be clarified. So that would be a starting point for me. In terms of let me just finish this.
Sorry.
In terms of my communication about non-duality, it has, in a way, no purpose. It's something I do. I enjoy doing it. Some people, or not vast numbers of people, some people seem to enjoy listening to it, and they do that. And, we have a conversation, we have questions and so forth. But there isn't anything at all in me that feels that in doing that, I could possibly get anybody anywhere, help them in any way, make it more likely that they might or might not see what non-duality is, whatever that phrase means. And one of the things that I remember I don't remember a lot in detail from our conversation in Glastonbury, but one of the things that I do remember, because I think it was the thing that most surprised me about it, was, I think, this is my memory anyway, that at one point you asked me, why I held meetings and communicated about this and so forth. And you seemed genuinely surprised that I didn't say that it's because I wanted to help people. I mean, why I do it, in a way, personal motivation is irrelevant to me. I mean, it's just something that happens. But if I went into personal motivation, I just sum it up as saying, well, it's kind of fun on a wet Saturday afternoon. It's more interesting than watching the football. And I was quite genuinely surprised that you seem to, I don't know, I might be wrong, but for me, you seem to struggle a little bit with, the concept that I should trudge my way up to London maybe on a wet Saturday afternoon and hold a meeting on non-duality without actually wanting to help people. I mean, it's not that I'm hard and callous and cruel. I mean, maybe I am, but I mean, it's not because of that. It's not that I, don't want to help people. If I saw an old lady struggling with shopping, I hope that I might offer to carry it across the road with her. It's just that, in this particular case, I think the thought that, of anybody helping anybody, let's say, see non-duality by giving a talk about it or answering questions about it or writing books about it, to me, it's just a nonsense. I've written 4 books on non-duality, which is far too many in a way. And I'll just finish this bit, by saying that, insofar as I had any reason for writing them, again, it was kind of fun. But the most accurate thing to say is just there was a kind of an energy came up to do that. And so that's what happened.
Oh, there's so much that I could sort of pick up on. This is what happened in our conversation, really, Walter, is that I'm constantly wanting going, well, you say that, but what does that mean? And so I think we are talking about the same thing. I think one of the differences is you see the thing we're talking about as not to do with anything else, whereas I see it as completely to do with everything else, and therefore completely engaged with everything that it means to be a human being, and not somehow separate off from that, including the sense that we're in community and that we might help each other. So that's just on that. The 2 things I wanted to pick up on was,
I see it exactly the same way.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, that's not the impression I just got from you.
Well, so let me clarify. I see, we're in community, we help each other, all these things happen. It's just that I don't see the communication of non-duality as a way to help people. I might help an old lady across the road, but I don't give talks on non-duality to help people.
Okay, no, I can, I don't feel that, but I completely hear what you're saying. But I think there's a general sense where you listed a whole load of things as if, I don't want to get into a dead end with it, with you, but it seemed like you listed, like I'm doing these other things and are we talking about the same thing? And I wanted to go, I think we are. It's just I would see all of those other things as ways of expressing what arises from these non-dual states. So let's leave that. The 2 things, one is I feel like at some point we should just dig into this idea that the meetings in London just happen, as if you're not organizing them and there's not intentionality and all the rest of it, unless you mean you're just unconscious. And with most of what I do is unconscious, only what I focus on is conscious. So I could go, most of it just happens. You could even say what I'm doing now is just happening because I'm doing it so fast there's no time to reflect on it. But there's something to be dug into there about it. And the other thing, just to come back on what you said, was I'm not from 1 minute saying that you do any of these things. I don't know. I've not really heard you speak for a very long time. I'm talking about me. I did this. I see Rupert Spira do it, for instance, and most of the other teachers that I've seen do it with pointing out exercises and all the rest. And really what they're doing there is they're going, look, can you see? I mean, the classic one is, can you see everything's arising in consciousness? And if that's a claim. So then my question for you, this is where the whole
I've just found, this may be the first point, but I think I've just found the first point in which we may be in total agreement.
Great. Well,
I certainly don't do that.
I mean,
to me, it's a kind of absurdity to do that.
So this whole conversation between us started not to find areas of disagreement, but actually, because I'm always slightly, I have this slight feeling often that I may be more in agreement with other people than they realize or I realize. So it started from I think the way the conversation started was, do you say there is no self? And if so, what is the self you're denying existence to?
Well,
because I'm sitting with Richard, so what is the self? Because we might agree. What is this self which doesn't exist? Because clearly Richard does.
I'll first go back to that thing that you were saying about Rupert Spira, etc., 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 doing pointing exercises and so forth. And I'm now slightly concerned that if we stay with that or kind of look at that too closely, this might turn into a love fest rather than a debate in which we disagree, because I mean, I couldn't.
I'm up for that. I'm a big love junkie.
Yeah, but it might get a bit tedious for the people who are watching, if anybody is other than Walter. But no, I'm in total agreement with that. And in
Although, just to make sure, I think we're
agree.
slightly different, Richard, with it, just to, to keep because I think your position on it, as I understand it, is it's just a waste of time. It's a bad thing. It's rubbish. My position on it is that it's not that, or it's not a good. I'd never do that. Sorry, I misinterpret you.
No, don't put words like that in my mouth. No, it's not
sorry.
that. No, I don't know. Sorry. I mean, I have a past, as I've already said, of taking people and groups through many what I would call transpersonal exercises. No, when my critique of it is purely that to me it doesn't have anything to do with or have any utility
with non-duality
in terms of someone, let's say, this very clumsy phrase, seeing non-duality. That's my critique of it.
I see. Okay. Whereas
so I wouldn't critique I wouldn't make a criticism of your kind of big love workshops or so forth. To me, I mean, I don't know a lot about them. It seems to be a very valid kind of approach to the transpersonal, I would call it, and so forth. But I don't see anything like that as having anything to do with, certainly not having anything to do with, the practical seeing of non-duality.
Okay.
Whatever the hell that means.
That's what. Well, let's find out what the hell that means, because you keep saying it, so it must mean something. And I would like to know what it means to you, because that again gave me the impression, wrongly I'm sure, but gave me the impression that you were saying this thing doesn't involve any of this. Whereas my experience would be my situation with, say, the pointing out exercises is they're fine. Just understand that they are not self-evident. They're absolutely not self-evident. Get that and then point them out. Fine. You're pointing out a way of seeing, which then someone could evaluate. Try it like this. That seems fine to me. But don't go try like this and it's self-validating. That's the problem I have with that.
I think there are certain kinds of exercises. I'm thinking here of Douglas Harding, for example, some of who's did a workshop with him many years ago. And I think, that exercise like that can have some kind of validity and interest in that they can produce a kind of aha. I mean, I remember, in fact, doing a very simple Douglas Harding exercise with a group of college students once, and one of them in particular, it obviously kind of shook their world quite a bit in a very, quite an unexpected way. So I think that can have some kind of rattle and shake validity. But again, it doesn't really have much to do, or possibly anything to do, with what I'm talking about in terms.
Okay, so that's the bit we need to understand.
Afternoons in London.
So there's two questions then that seem important. I mean, okay, leave that. The two questions: what do you mean then? What is it you're talking about? And secondly, this thing about the self. Are you saying there's no self? And if so, what is the self you are denying? Or are you not? Or are you saying you're not saying no self?
Sorry, there were two questions there.
Yes.
I have a very short memory span. Give me one of them, whichever one you want me to go for.
Let's start with the no self one, because Walter started us off with that, with me talking about I am not a person. And by the way, Walter, I think it would be helpful before we end for me to go back and explain, I think, the two ways that I saw that experience and how they're different. I think that might be interesting to people, but may not relate to Richard, because Richard may be talking about something completely different or have a different interpretation. And that's what I'd like to get is, so yeah, Richard, do you say there is no self? Is that a thing for you? You're not a person? And if so, what is the self you are denying?
I'm quite happy to say there is no self. I'm quite happy to describe this as seeing through the person. When I say I'm happy to, within the limitations of language, given that, there's no way that language can even get close to this. Those phrases are a million miles away, but they're still probably the closest maybe that I feel we can get. So I'm happy enough to say this. Yes, that I again, ill-advisedly, perhaps we have to use words. I use words like awakening, and liberation. And I would say that, you know, what awakening consists of is precisely, yes, it's the disappearance of the person.
What is, so
Disappearance
when
of
you
the
say the
sense of
person,
self,
what does
you
that
know.
mean? What does that word refer to?
The
It's
disappearance,
disappearing.
the disappearance. I mean, I mean, here, and I know that, you know, this is true for many, many people, although
Yeah.
I'm sure it's not always the case.
What does it mean,
The
though, Richard?
first
What does?
initial opening to this was the complete absence of any sense whatsoever of a human being, a person, a body, mind, whatever. And
So,
and
the
yet,
end.
let me just finish this. And
Okay.
yet, everything that a second before had been arising for the person and seemed to be arising in something mysterious called their consciousness, which is a very unwise phrase to use, was now simply arising. Now, I cannot put it any clearer than that.
Okay. No,
But
I
there's
can
no point
understand.
really pressing me on what that means, because that is I have put that in the clearest way that I
No,
can.
it's very clear.
And
I
if
got it.
it's not clear, it will remain unclear.
Yeah, no, I got it. The thing which I'm interested in is your interpretation of it, because, like you said, I think these experiences are very common, actually, or not very common, but they're commonplace, and I'm sure you've had many of them, and I've certainly been exploring it for so many decades. There's been all sorts, but it seems to me that so you have an experience in which suddenly there is no other.
No.
So if I think about an experience I had.
I did not have an experience. This is
Oh,
one
you
of the
didn't have, there
fundamental
wasn't.
issues.
Okay,
No,
okay,
because when that was happening, Richard wasn't there.
okay. So there
That's why
was what?
I insist
Okay,
on
no,
saying it's
okay.
not
So
an
what's the language
experience.
you would like to use then to say? You would. So there was when you can't. Why was it?
I thought I
What?
just described it.
Yeah, not very well though, because
Well,
now, because not because of the words, not because of the words, not because of that. Because I'm happy to go with any words you want. I just like it's you're going. I'm speaking to Richard now, and Richard is saying I had an experience earlier in my life, which has led me to think that the self is an illusion.
no, Richard isn't saying that.
Okay, right?
Richard is saying there was apparently in this thing called time
Yeah.
an experience, if we're going to use that word, where
Okay.
Richard wasn't there and wasn't having the experience.
Okay, but when I had an experience, well, when there was an experience in this flow of time where Tim wasn't there, that was an experience which I can tell you about, and you're having an experience that you can tell me about. So
I'm having
hang on, you're relating an experience and I can relate an experience. So there's some connection there between Tim and Richard and that past experience, which is different from your relationship with the experience that I had a few years ago.
Well, I'm more interested in the relationship, not between Tim and Richard's experience, but between, let's say, Richard sitting here talking about it. And again, I prefer to say that it was a non-experience, but it doesn't really matter. Again, it's just language, but, relating back in the story of time, so there's someone here, there's a person here, a character, whatever you want to call it, narrating a time in which I'm hesitating because I want to use this, who knows, a split second, timeless, eternity, who knows? There was no one there.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yet everything is unchanged.
Yeah.
And I think one of the important things about this, and a point I would make that for me is very sort of essential to make the difference between this and the kind of transpersonal experiences that I've had earlier, and why I think, we're talking about a kind of different paradigm with this to transpersonal experiences, is that sort of split second, 2 seconds, who knows, timeless or whatever, was then profoundly transformative. And the way I always put it was profoundly transformative on the Richard character, the Richard person, the Richard individual, whatever you want to call it, who then came back after that.
Right. So where had he gone?
I have absolutely no idea.
Because I tell you this thing, I tell you a thing that happens to me every night, Richard.
No.
Every night I lay down in a bed and this Tim Freke character, he just disappears. And then sometimes I'm someone else in a different world. And then that just ends. And then the guy on the bed comes back. Is that the right interpretation? Or is there a more sophisticated interpretation which allows us then to go, look, the reason that my past experience, or this past experience, let's use your language that I want to talk about, and the one that you are talking about relates to Richard, and the other one relates to Tim, becomes very obvious if you see it in a more, I want to say, a different way, let's call it.
I'm now less worried that this is going to become a love fest about how neither of us relate to what Rupert Spira teaches. Because again, I mean, I couldn't be in a more profoundly different place in describing this from where you are. What I'm trying very inadequately to describe, because it is impossible to describe, is in a different. I don't want to go to in a different cosmos. I'll stick with as a million miles away from.
I know the experience you're talking about. I absolutely know it.
Well, here there can be no possibility of confusing that with the experience of going to sleep or dreaming.
I'm not comparing the experiences remotely. I'm talking about interpretation, Richard. I'm saying that those things, which are utterly different, completely different, but nevertheless we interpret them. They're dramatic in that the big difference. No, we come, we go, but we don't say things like Richard came back. Let me. So the way I would see all of these experiences.
So can you just clarify that the thing about we don't say Richard came back?
Well, you said you had the experience and then Richard came back.
Yes. Well, yeah. It's a way of putting.
And I said, where did he go? And the reason I said that was I suspect he didn't go anywhere. Because, and I think that the key is understanding the nature of consciousness. And it seems to me now, and this is one of the big shifts from the traditional Indian view, which I'd imbued, is that consciousness is not some abstract present thing that everything happens in. But consciousness that's a reification, making a thing out of actually what's a process. And that actually all these different systems of which I'm one, are in relationship with each other. It's the one thing in relationship with itself in all these different forms. And every single system is processing its environment in all of these complex ways. And the way that a human being does it is through the senses and then interpretation of the senses with a whole complex of ideas and ideational network. And that what consciousness is the ability to focus in that. So which is why now, if anyone's listening, you can try it for yourselves. You know, if you focus now on your left foot, you'll be conscious of it, and you weren't before. And if you focus on the back of your head, you're now conscious of that. So wherever you put your attention, you will be conscious of it. Now, most of the time, what we pay attention to is regular stuff. But sometimes spontaneously, often through things like meditation, sometimes through psychedelics, perhaps, all sorts of things, but spontaneously, let's just say, the attention shifts. Now, if the attention shifts really dramatically, which is what's happened for you, I suspect, and what definitely I'm talking about in the experiences I've had, what your consciousness what you are conscious of is simply this other thing. Now, if you become conscious of the ground of being, the oneness of all things, which is not anything in particular, that will fill you up, and that is samadhi, and it's extraordinary when to experience that. But Tim is experiencing it. It's just that Tim is not conscious of Tim because his attention is elsewhere. And that is similar to what happens at night when Tim isn't conscious of Tim because he's paying attention to his dreams or to nothing. But so what I think is happening here is that people are becoming conscious of something which is in fact timeless because there's nothing to change, which is in fact non-dual because it has no particular qualities. And then they come back and go, oh, Tim's back. But Tim hasn't gone anywhere. Tim experienced that. It was just that I am a conscious being able to experience that level of reality. And it's not something most of us experience all the time because it's actually a very emergent state. But nevertheless, when you do, it has a massive impact on you. The mistake is the interpretation. And that's why I say to go, I disappeared and then I came back is a strange way of seeing it, as opposed to I paid attention to something else and then my attention came back to paying attention to this.
Believe me, Tim, I mean, yeah, there is a gulf between us. Believe me, if the, again, I'll stick with the word experience because it's not good, but there's none better. If the experience was, what you say, then that's how I would describe it.
No.
Yeah,
no, that's naive. That's naive.
Yes.
No, that shows a lack of your reflection to not know that you could interpret it in other ways.
I think that's pretty patronising to say.
No, I think I would say it to everyone. I certainly would say, and I would say it to myself.
A lack of my reflection. I mean,
any experience you can interpret in different ways.
Can I also say that the experience that I was talking about, which was the split second experience, had nothing to do with Samadhi either.
That's the word.
Nothing whatsoever. I mean, that if you like, that came later. If you like.
I don't mean to label the word. I don't mean to label anything you've experienced with words that you don't want to label them with. I'm really happy not to use Indian words altogether. All that I'm suggesting is that there are and who knows which is right. Let's not even get into which is right. The first step is just to be able to see there are always different ways of interpreting what occurs, let's say, so it's non-volitional and doesn't have a subject involved. Just that, because that's the first step. If you can make that step, that's true. That's true just as much if I was talking to a Christian fundamentalist, or when I've done that. It's like the first step is to find the assumption they can't challenge. And if you can challenge that, then you can move into a world where there's other possibilities. And any experience, it seems to me, well, I just created a different narrative, and you've returned to, no, it was self-evident what it was. And I'm going, was it? It was an experience.
The difference between us is that you are I'm talking about something. You're choosing to name what I'm saying an interpretation, which you're perfectly entitled to say. I am labeling it a description. And I feel like I'm going out of my way, actually, in what I'm saying, not to interpret it. I mean, I can interpret it. I have interpreted it. I've written books about this stuff. But I'm being very careful in trying to stick with description rather than interpretation. And I feel quite sure that you're not going to accept that. So, go ahead and don't accept it.
Well, it's like it doesn't worry me what you do really at all. But in terms of the conversation we're having, I want to keep suggesting that when you go, yes, I would be happy to say there is no self, and you're saying that, that's Richard in that room saying it based on the experiences that have some link to Richard, otherwise he would not be saying it. And that all needs to be encompassed within whether what you're saying makes any sense.
So, I'll just say we have a tremendous amount of questions coming in. We get about 50 people watching live, and just want to throw that in there.
Well, we can have some questions if you like.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, do we have a kind of time limit for this? Or
yes, we are going
2 days.
No more than 3 days, Richard. No more than 3 days.
Yeah, I think 3 days will be. No, honestly, 90 minutes. I was thinking. Okay, so
well, maybe we should take some questions then.
Yeah. Well, we're 40 minutes in. Yeah. So here we go.
I think we may get bogged down otherwise. Yeah.
Unless you had any other things you wanted to say to wrap that part of it up.
The thing I would like to say to wrap up what I was saying was simply to say that what I'm suggesting is that the experiences that Richard's described, and I could describe mine the same, that pretty much, and the experience we're having right now are both real. And that the idea that one is real and one is the illusion of the self is a mistake, a profound mistake. And that there is a way of understanding all of this that brings it all together. And it's not something else, something other. It's actually everything is one thing. And these very, very emergent states actually impact and play into the journey of the individual, and that they're both really important, and they exist together. Just like the obviousness of look around you, it's all one and it's all individual. Just look. And the fact that there's three of us here, and yet we're discussing oneness, but I don't know what Walter's going to say next. And so there is this individuality, the one thing in relationship with itself as individual things. And that is its nature. And seeing both of those is really important.
And what I say, maybe I'll just pick up that word understanding. I would say from my point of view, understanding, in terms of talking what I'm talking about, I would say understanding has somewhere between very little importance and no importance whatsoever. And in saying that, I mean, what I mean really by that is I'm aware that there are many, many cases of what I would call seeing, where there is very limited understanding, perhaps none at all, but certainly very limited understanding. There are also cases where there is masses understanding. You know, it's like, you know, I've talked to people, and particularly I've had perhaps somewhat hostile emails occasionally from people who seem to have, you know, digested the entire works of, you know, the Advaita canon, etc., 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 and they're very interested in putting me in my place because I haven't. So equally, it seems to me there can be profound, vast, and gigantic understanding and absolutely no seeing whatsoever.
I agree completely with that.
I mean, I'm kind of a little bit interested. I can't pretend not to be interested in understanding at all, because I write books and give talks about this stuff. So obviously there is some interest there, but really, you know, it's kind of fun to, you know, get our heads around ideas about this and get some understanding or whatever. It's a kind of fun game in a way, but it's really not the essence at all of what it is that I'm interested in here.
I would agree. It's not the essence of it at all.
All right.
We've got some questions.
Next question. Here we go.
I might regret asking. I don't know what questions are coming, and I might bitterly regret asking for the questions to come now. Who knows?
Well, feel free to pass on any question. Also,
is that within the rules?
There's no rules. This is boundless and free and chaotic. Okay, here we go. Has your sense of morality, if you had any, shifted after non-dual seeing? And that's to the panel. So who has your sense of morality changed after seeing
maybe we should answer for each other, Richard, see if we get it right. Because I'm going to say that Richard's going to say, no, it's nothing to do with any of that. Am I right?
Oh, right. Okay.
Am I right?
No,
right?
I'm not going to answer for Tim. No. Sorry. Can you just ask the question again?
Sure. I'm just gonna. I'm gonna read.
It'd be interesting to see if we understood each other's place enough to be able to say the other point of view.
One of the problems of this for me is I have a very brief attention span. So by the time the question's been finished or Tim said a sentence or two or whatever, I've lost complete track. Something about morality. Has your sense of
morality, if you had any, I like that, how they add that in, shifted after non-dual seeing?
I hope this isn't evasive, because I'm going to say I'm not sure, but I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way. One of the things, I mean, I was a sincere spiritual seeker for 30 years, and I came across a lot of very, very, very heavy morality and moralism in that time, particularly for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, amongst the Buddhists, but never mind that. And one of the things I found so delightful when I was finally dragged a bit reluctantly to see Tony again, and I first heard this message in its full force or whatever, was not an absence of morality, this total lack of moralism that I'd been so used to in the spiritual. It felt so freeing. You know, and I suddenly kind of thought, God, the constrictions on the spiritual path, you know, the kind of need to be good and do good and think good thoughts, and oh God, what a prison. And so I did find the kind of complete absence of moralism very, very refreshing when I came across this communication in the particular way that I did. And I'm kind of a bit stuck on whether my own morality has changed. I mean, I didn't murder people on the streets before I came across non-duality, and I don't murder people on the streets now. But I think I have a much more acute sense now of the kind of critical shoulds, oughts, and musts of moralism when I come across it. And I mean, when I'm back in my therapy days, I learnt, you know, as some therapists say, that, you know, we should, if, you know, avoid, if we can, hardening of the arteries and masturbation. I just feel that much more profoundly now. And I do remember in one of the early talks I gave, I was asked by somebody, I not really asked, it was a comment during my introductory talk. She said, but if what you're saying is right, then that means I can go and murder people on the streets. And I thought this was a very strange interpretation, but it is one that I've sort of come across since. And it is kind of quite fascinating how the mind can hear a communication that's saying there is no one who is actually doing anything or who is making the choice to do something, and then turn that into a communication that says there's no morality, so it doesn't matter if you go and murder people on the streets. So there's something very
Is there self-responsibility, Richard, for you?
We'll come on to that maybe, who knows, but let's first of all, it also reminds me of something I don't quote very often, but Moody, I mean, I don't know, I heard Moody quoted as having said this. It may not have been original to him, that somebody said to him, is it okay if I go and kill somebody on the streets? And he said, well, you know, because this is a dream, does it, you know, is that okay? And he said, well, yeah, it's fine if you don't mind being hunted down by the dream police and put in a dream prison and tried and, you know, put back in a dream prison. So there's a sort of kind of
wow,
strange,
that's a horrible answer.
Strange
That's
misapprehension.
horrible.
Hang on,
That is absolutely horrible.
There's a sort of strange misapprehension.
Wow,
strange misapprehension.
that is
or
ugly.
Misinterpretation of this communication. You know, that
just think about what you just said.
Personalize it. I know perfectly well what I just said, Tim, in quoting Moody there.
That's.
I think it's making, you know, it's making.
To say that the
quote Moody, but it's making a point, you know, about the difference. You know, this is, you know, this lives its life, and in the life it lives, there are consequences. That's what Moody was saying.
What was interesting is that you focused on the consequence for the perpetrator as that being the moral question. That's why it felt like really ugly idea. And I am interested to know, if you say there is no self, there presumably can be no self-responsibility. There can be no sense that you're responsible for anything, which is the very basis of any form of morality, that you are responsible for your actions. But if your actions are just happening, like your events just happened, and you just happen to do whatever you happen to do, like Ramesh Balskar, who was one of the people that had an influence on me, just happening to have affairs with these young women at his retreats or whatever it was that happened, then there is no morality, is there? There's no responsibility. So it's just gone.
Using another image that I and other people often use, which again I think you'll object to, I would say, you know, another way of explaining is, you know, this is a dream character. This is a dream character living in a dream world, and in that dream world, various things happen, including consequences, including morality arises or it doesn't, moralism arises or it doesn't, things are done, da, 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 da. I don't think that you like this description, but for
it's very close to the description
it's a way again of trying to describe things. You know, there's a dream character here, just as there's if you like, a dream character in sleep, and this dream character performs actions, and those actions certainly appear to have consequences. And I think, you know, it would be pretty weird of me to sit here and deny that. I mean, I would never want to deny that.
Well, I see it a bit differently. I think the experience we've been talking about, for me, the non-dual experience is the experience of the ground of being, the thing that makes everything one, which is non-dual. It's not two, because it's what makes it all one thing. It has no other qualities but existing. So when you pay attention to that, those are the experiences, I think, that's where the non-dual experience arises, and there's no self, there's no time, there's no anything, because it's the formless. But that's not actually the experience I'm really interested in. What the experience I'm interested in primarily is that it seems to me that the whole of reality is that field of being evolving. And I'm interested in the most evolved level of that field, of the particularity of things. And I experience that as something greater than me. I think the traditional word for it is God. It's a difficult word because I don't mean by it anything like the religious meaning of the word is, but there is a presence which is incredibly loving and beautiful to commune with. And I won't go into how I see that because that's too big a picture, but what that does for me, what's interesting is that when I enter into that, that's the big love. That's why I use the phrase big love. This enormous love, which embraces everything. But that it's an emotion, so it doesn't last when the situation moves on. But what I have noticed over the decades is that there is something which builds in the character of Tim as he's making this journey through life, as he is evolving. Which I would call a universal benevolence. There's like this incredible wishing well to everything and everyone, whenever possible. That stays, and so I would say the morality, the ethic, which has come from the journey for me, is that universal benevolence, wishing well whenever possible to everything and everyone, but also grounded in the opposite, because that comes from the oneness, because everything is one. But also, I'm individual. I am that oneness as this particular perspective on itself. And therefore, my individual responsibility is how I respond to the one as Tim. And that's my responsibility. And so what I want to bring to that responsibility is that universal benevolence. And my attempt at being wise is to do my best to do that in any situation.
So in what you said there, I mean, one thing that I sort of I like, and as a description, yeah, I'll go along with universal benevolence. Yes, emptiness and fullness. I often talk about emptiness and fullness, and the natural question is, okay, well, what's fullness? The phrase I use is unconditional love, so that would be my equivalent. I think that is a part of this seeing, not the kind of initial seeing that we were talking about so much previously, but ultimately, when this seeing, has taken place, I think that's partly a kind of, benevolent shock. I mean, it's a benevolent shock. I think it often has people laughing when they see it, just the recognition of the beingness of unconditional love, or the unconditional love of beingness, but it either way you like.
All right. Unconditional love. We have a question about that. It says, what is unconditional love as it relates to the appearance of existence?
Do you want to add anything to what you were saying, Richard?
Well, I'll have a go at that. I don't really understand part of the question, as it relates to the beingness of existence or whatever it was. But I think unconditional love is astonishingly, and it is astonishing if we kind of look at the I'm going to use this phrase again, the kind of, the sort of the dream existence in which we live. It is astonishing then to have the realization, not that anybody has it, that this is an outpouring of unconditional love. I say this a lot in meetings, and I get a lot of pushback against it, and I'm not surprised, because if we focus on what is apparently happening in this again, I'm going to use this phrase, dream world. It certainly doesn't look like unconditional love. So I have the utmost empathy in a way with the mind, with people and people with their minds pushing back against that and objecting to it. And I know in a way what I'm often resort to saying when I'm talking about unconditional love. I think sometimes I just use the phrase, well, on behalf of oneness, all I can do is profoundly apologize, because it is a kind of an astonishing statement to make. I don't feel it can be justified intellectually, but it is a description simply of what is seen, what's seen over and over and over again by a parent person after a parent person after a parent person. And I was once asked the question about this that I most remember. I was once asked in a talk in Germany by a young woman who seemed very, very stern and very, I thought, rather disapproving. And she was hovering over me at the end of the meeting, actually. And she said, I just want to ask you one question. You say that everything is unconditional love. Does that include dog shit? And I said, well, of course it includes dog shit, because if it didn't include dog shit, it wouldn't be unconditional. And for whatever reason, whether it satisfies anybody else who's watching this video, it seemed to satisfy her. And to my immense relief, she burst into a warm smile and gave me a hug at that. But yeah, the nature of this, the fundamental nature of this, is unconditional love. And if you challenge me to justify that, other beyond what I've already said, I will maybe simply burst into tears, because I can't do it. It's simply a description that I make, and many other people make as well.
Well, I can definitely interact with that. And I kind of want to catch it, but I also really want to ask you this, and I don't want us to get sidetracked from love, because, you know, I'm a love junkie. But what is the difference for you between a person and an apparent person? What is the difference?
The difference is very simple. The difference is simply that something has happened, and I can't describe or explain what that something is.
Yes.
Whereby the one who felt themselves to be simply a person, where that is seen through.
And so when you see somebody else, like the girl, and she's now an apparent person.
No. I wouldn't really put it like that.
You just did.
What?
You just did.
Sorry, you'll have to clarify that, Tim.
You just did put it like that. That's why I picked up on it. So so really what you're saying is that a person becomes an apparent person when they also know that it's all one, or there is also the knowing that it's all one.
No, that's not what I meant. No, I just meant.
Okay. You know, so what's the difference?
From the perspective,
there's still an apparent person.
From the perspective of what we're talking about, it wasn't from the perspective of what we're talking about, you know.
Okay. All right. Anyway, let that go.
This charming young woman, or if you like, apparent young woman, you know, it's just a throwaway. You know.
Yeah, these are interesting to pick up on.
Important, you know, the interesting thing about that was the dog shit, actually.
Okay, so I would suggest that,
which also, in a way, because it points very much to, you know, how the extent to which what we're talking about in unconditional is impersonal. Because as a person, clearly that is not how I see dog shit. Clearly, it isn't. As a person, an apparent person, a character, whatever we want to.
I would turn all that.
Divine puppet. I'm going to settle on divine puppet. I like that one.
Divine puppet.
I think that was. I heard that. I heard that.
String is to pull me down.
Yes, Tim. Yes, a divine puppet. I heard that first from Nathan Gill, so I always credit him with it. But I've no idea if it was his. He probably got it from somebody else.
Yeah, see, I think these are really ugly ideas. Anyway, let's let go.
We are. Well, I want to say at this point,
I mean, just aesthetically ugly.
I thought at Glastonbury we were miles apart. I think actually we're probably further apart than I thought. But
well, I certainly would like to turn what you just said about love completely on its head, because I would suggest that without doubt, I think you know this. If you've read the literature and written about it, you know that people have experienced throughout history that coming into states of oneness, non-dual states, whatever names, different states perhaps, and there's this enormous love. So, and I've seen literally hundreds, thousands of people have that experience. So what is that? Now, you described it as the outpouring. This is the outpouring of the whole thing, is the outpouring of unconditional love. And that's a traditional Indian view, which I've come to think is wrong. Because it seems to me like the ground from which everything is arising, the ground which is the ground of being, which is non-dual, which is in this process, process of relationship, of duality and becoming everything, has no qualities. It just has no, it's actually non-dual. It's formless, has no qualities whatsoever. That's the point. And it is being, so it's a formless field, if you like, let's use that analogy, formless field of being informed by evolving information. And that, so what reality is a process of forming. So where does the love come from? Well, love is something, it's an emotion, it's something we feel, it's evolved, but that it's evolved to a very, very high level. And so that the whole universe has flowered into something which is unconditional love, which is why when you look at the universe, it's pretty rough out there, not because it's come from that, but because it's flowered into that. So we can experience it, and that the unconditional or the all-embracing love, whatever that, agape, metta, whatever, that is what happens when you see as an individual that you are one with everything and everyone. And the response, the feeling response, because that's what love is one of love, enormous love. And as you go into it, you realize, this is the most emergent level of this 14 billion year process. It's not where it's come from, it's where it's going. It's where it's got to. And that, I think, solves the riddle of how could the world be the way it is, given that, just biology, just the brutality of the whole thing, if it's all an outpouring of love, which doesn't seem to make sense. And the reason I don't think, eventually I had to push myself for years with that question until I went, no, it doesn't make sense. But it does make sense if you see it in an evolutionary context. Then it really does make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense to the mind. Absolutely not. I think this is.
It's not going to make sense to anything else, is it?
I say it's either seen or it isn't seen. The kind of the evolving. I mean, I know this is another of your projects. The kind of evolving universe, sort of developing a new spiritual cosmology, and so forth. To me, again, it's just another complication, another story. It's not something that interests me. Of course, obviously, it doesn't interest me, but
so I would like to hone in.
I think it's very appealing, I think,
on this idea that somehow you can see things like it's coming. You can see it's all arising from unconditional love.
I can't see
but
that.
You said that. You said it was a seeing.
What?
You said it was a seeing, not the mind.
Yes, it's a seeing when I'm not there. It can't be seen when the person's there.
Okay,
when
but there is
there, then unconditional love is absent, I would say.
Right.
When
okay,
the person isn't there, then unconditional love may be seen.
It's being seen, but by no one.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, that is what I'm going to.
I don't apologize. I'm just trying to make sense of what you're saying.
I feel like I mean,
and there's no ideas involved in your description.
Sorry?
And yet here's the problem with the epistemology. If you can distinguish what you're talking about from everything else, which you clearly can, because you keep going, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, and I agree with you in that respect. That you can distinguish it means you must be categorizing it differently. Otherwise, you couldn't distinguish it. So for you to be able to distinguish this type of non-dual experience from an experience which isn't a non-dual experience, you must be categorizing it. And that's what ideas are. Now, the fact is, you're categorizing with a million ideas, everything all the time. You just don't know you're doing it because it's all unconscious. And I think what happens is people get confused between, I'm not conscious of how I'm doing this, with the idea that somehow I'm doing it directly with no ideas. Because you're not thinking, because thinking's just imagining talking to yourself. That stops. You don't imagine talking to yourself. It's gone. But that doesn't mean that you're not still discriminating what you're experiencing, because you're doing that all the time. And you're not conscious that you're doing it. so that you are able to go, that was an experience of oneness, as opposed to, or that it was an experience in which there was no self, any of that categorization, for it to be that experience and not another experience, means there's an ideational content. It's just you're not conscious of it.
Well, again, we're kind of, across a divide here, because I'm talking about something which...
Can you see the challenge I'm actually issuing, Richard? Can you actually understand what I'm saying? Can you see the problem, at least?
I can see the problem that you think is there.
No. Can you see?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's what I'm saying. But can you see? Can you see that if you can discriminate this from that, here's non-dual experience. Here's the experience of Richard being Richard. That you can tell those two apart means you must be seeing a difference between.
No. That's absolutely not what I'm saying.
So you're not seeing a difference between.
I'm saying virtually the opposite. I'm saying, as long as there is the experience, whatever the hell that means, of non-duality in Richard, then that isn't it, because that's duality.
No.
I'm talking about the possibility of the disappearance of that.
Yes, but that you are able to know that it's the disappearance of it. That you can know that. That it is the absence of something means you must be categorizing it in some way. You just don't know you are.
Well, there's someone here reporting on it, but what is being reported on is something that is seen when this and this are no longer two.
Yes, but in the seeing of it, you must be categorizing it. Otherwise, you wouldn't know you were seeing it.
In the talking about it, yes. I know you assert this, Tim, but I simply don't agree with you. So
I'd like you to explain. I'd like to explain how you can tell it apart from a different experience if there's nothing to tell it apart from.
There is the disappearance, if you like, of the one who experiences, and then there is just whatever there is.
Yeah.
And later there may not be a report about that.
Is it not a simpler, more coherent explanation to say that Richard, who'd been studying spirituality all his life and moving into this, and then listened to a whole load of things that blew his mind from Tony Parsons, took his attention, and instead of it being like, I can't get this, actually, boom, and discriminated reality in a way he'd never done before, and went, fuck. Because there was no attention on Richard anymore, no attention on time anymore. He discriminated the field of being, the non-dual, which he'd never been able to find before, and suddenly he could. And it blew his mind. And then his attention came back, and he went, oh, Richard's back.
Well, two things come to me. One is, that's Tim Freke's description, and it's not mine, and I'm not taking it on. And the second is that I'm beginning to wonder whether the people watching this, if there are some, maybe we've chewed this one over enough, and I'm just wondering whether there's another question, please.
Okay, yes, we have plenty of questions. We have more questions than we can get to in the next 20 minutes. So anyway, the next one is about meaning and purpose. And so let's see. It says, has your sense of purpose, if you had any, that must be from the same person, been changed after non-dual seeing? And I'll just add to that. I do know, Richard, I don't want to misquote, but something about hopelessness, purposeless, meaningless. There was some kind of a mantra.
Great mantra. Hopeless, meaningless, hopeless meaning, hopeless, purposeless, meaningless, something like that. That was the great mantra. That also came to me at a meeting of Nathan Gill's. So Nathan is sort of figuring quite strongly in this meeting, but I think I went first on the last one, so maybe Tim should on this one.
Rest in peace, Nathan Gill. Okay, yes, go ahead.
I don't know, Nathan. He's died. So is there purpose? So for me, the recognition of the oneness of all things and non-duality of things is a ground from which everything else is happening. So I think life is full of purpose. I think there is immense hope. And I think meaning is an emergent quality of the universe. And that when we experience it is beautiful. But I think if we have that sense of being just an isolated individual, we haven't recognized the depth of our individuality, that it reaches back into our universality. So that when you go, oh, I'm the whole thing, as Tim in relationship with the whole thing, it's a fundamental shift. And that's what I mean by the shift from an individual to a unividual. And the level of hope, meaning, and purpose is absolutely immense. And I can go into the why all these things are, but I'd like to give Richard a chance to respond.
What was the question again?
Okay. It has your sense of purpose changed after non-dual seeing?
Oh, my sense of purpose. Oh, yes, probably. I mean, I'll start with that mantra. It came to me at a meeting of Nathan Gill's. I mean, well, I'd say it came to me. It sort of burst from my lips spontaneously when Nathan was talking. It just popped into my head in view of what he was saying. Hopeless, helpless, meaningless. And there was a friend of mine there who came up to me in the tea break and said, Richard, that was the most depressing thing I've ever heard anybody say. And I started to kind of apologize to them. I said, no, it was wonderful as well. And I've kind of suggested it, I have to say, at least half jokingly, maybe more than half jokingly, as a mantra in many meetings: hopeless, helpless, and meaningless. And there is something about, I think, again, we've talked earlier about the possibility of this split second of awakening, and it can produce profound changes. And one of the profound changes, which is fairly common, is that people often find themselves in a state of despair, feeling hopeless and feeling helpless and feeling that everything's meaningless. And it sounds kind of quite dreadful in a way, in a sort of existential way. But I suggest that in some ways, particularly to someone who's been a very passionate seeker, it can actually paradoxically seem a tremendous relief to feel that everything is hopeless, I am helpless, and this is meaningless. And it is kind of relating to the question that's asked, I hope, because instead of meaning, we could say purposeless. So, the situation, if you like, the existential situation is hopeless. I am helpless, and everything is meaningless. It can produce a kind of exhale of relief and a kind of a relaxation. And one of the things that, again, I won't bang on about for too long because I've written and spoken about it a great deal, is how we tend to think that hope is a positive thing and despair is a negative thing. And I think this can turn it on its head and make us realize that actually hope can be very cruel and very tiring, and that actually despair, if there is genuinely a kind of sense of despair, it can actually bring about some relaxation, because if despair is real, then after all, there's kind of nothing that I can do. And so paradoxically, there can be a kind of relaxation and relief in that. And if I was saying this at a meeting, at a live in-person meeting, I'd probably at this moment throw in this quote from an English Buddhist: relaxation is, I can't get the quotation exactly, relaxation is the key to Buddhahood. That's it. Relaxation is the key to Buddhahood, right here, right now. Keith Dowman, I think his name was. I love that quote. I absolutely love it. And it's not quite so obvious, but it's a little bit paradoxical that if nothing else can produce relaxation, despair sometimes can. However, I do feel I've dodged maybe the intent of the question, which was more about me as a person or a character. Has it changed my sense of purpose? In which case, rather briefly, because I've taken up a lot of time on the other thing now, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. Yes, it has. Yes, probably in the sense of taking things a great deal less seriously now, including the idea of an evolving universe. I'm very suspicious, by the way. I know that this isn't your thing, Tim, but I don't know, it may be a little bit associated with it. I'm extremely suspicious of the idea. Oh, no, perhaps it is your thing. I'm very suspicious of the idea of evolutionary enlightenment and the kind of teachings and teachers that it sort of produces, because it seems to me, that once we've got the idea of evolutionary enlightenment and we have a teacher of such a thing, then we can become entrapped in a kind of, never-ending pathway or hamster wheel of endeavor, which in some cases, I think, there's one particularly well-known case, but I'm not going to name him on here, can lead
Ken
to
Wilber.
no,
No, you're thinking of Andrew Cohen.
no. I've got to put that straight before I'm sued. I genuinely
So-
was not thinking of Ken Wilber, but there is certainly
I did a whole
one high-profile case where
I did a little film with
certainly kind of exploited that philosophy pretty hard. Yeah, so it's
so
not something
my
that
sense
I'm drawn to.
Richard, would be that with Andrew, who after his dramatic fall from grace, I had a conversation with. My sense with Andrew, and this is not anything I haven't said directly to him, is that the evolutionary part of what he's exploring is incredibly interesting, and mostly from Ken, but it's interesting. The mistake I suggest to him is that he's still trapped in a triad of really bad ideas from Indian religion. And the triad is the idea of enlightenment, that there is a thing called enlightenment, the idea that there is a ego that wants to stop you being enlightened and must be got rid of, and the idea that there's a guru who's already experienced this, who can help you defeat your ego and become enlightened. And I think it's that triad which is the reason for India being dominated historically and still by cults, because they're a perfect way of generating cults. And we even brought an awful lot of that across to the West. And I embraced a lot of it when I was younger. But I think that's the problem he's got, not the evolutionary bit. It's the idea that there is a place to arrive, and that it's the absence of the self which will get you there, and somebody who's already got there can show you. I think those are the things which cause it to be so disastrous.
I think there may be two things that you said in there that I agree with. One is, again, I might have misunderstood, but I would certainly say, that the idea that there's an ego that has to be got rid of is a mistake, and there's a guru who can get you there is a mistake. So if those are two things you said, then I agree with that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Here's another one. How useful do you think non-duality one-to-ones are, given that there's no self and nothing to do?
Well,
either one of you can take that.
Well, I do non-duality one-to-ones, not very often, fairly rarely, but as and when, if people really want one, I will do one. So what were the two things again? How useful?
Oh, given how useful?
Well, obviously not useful at all.
Non-duality one-to-ones, given that there's no self and nothing to do.
Oh, right. So just one question. Well, obviously not useful. They can't possibly. In what way could they possibly be useful, except maybe in in a kind of relative kind of divine puppet character of Richard, character of Fred, who's asking the questions. On that level, they can be useful in the sense that, for example, feedback I've had might be that they have clarified some questions for the mind. That's one thing, fair enough. Another thing is they have clarified some concerns about feelings that are going on. For example, a collapse into despair. That's another thing. And the third thing that comes to me is that often a kind of breakout into this kind of interest, never mind the seeing, can be disastrous for relationships. So there may have been a complete breakdown in a relationship as a result of this, and the person to whom I'm speaking indicates that, it's been kind of helpful in clarifying what's been going on there, what's been happening, some understanding of that. So on that kind of level, it can be helpful. But in terms of what we're really talking about here, seeing, apprehending the possibility of there being an opening to this, well, no, obviously not. Of course, not helpful. And again, I have a deep, deep distrust of teachers, or whatever they may call themselves, who might make a claim that a kind of one-to-one with the divine presence of Fred or Peter or Richard or Robert, whoever it might be, if they make some sort of claim that this might somehow bring about what it is that we're talking about here. I'm extremely suspicious of that.
So my answer, Walter, would be, the way I want to answer it is to say this. As far as we understand it right now, and we've got lots of good reasons to take this seriously, 14 billion years ago, the oneness of being had arisen as hydrogen. That was it, bit of helium. 14 billion years later, there's you and me and the person who asked that question, which has arisen through that process and is now conscious and is looking at the universe consciously, taking it in and having a conversation about what it is and going, have you experienced this? Have you experienced that? Have you seen it's all one? And able to have that. To me, your individuality is utterly sublime. It is so important. That evolutionary process, which you are, you are it. It's happening to you every day. It's happening to you now as you're listening, as you're thinking about ideas that I'm saying, Richard's saying, your own ideas, judging what works for you, what doesn't. Your psyche, your soul, psyche means soul, is evolving. It's happening right now. There's no question about it, I don't think. And my attitude is, I'm here for a short period of time and I'm going to die. And I'm here with all of these other individuals who are exploring this, and they're all expressions of the same oneness. And anything I can do which might help, sometimes it seems to, I generally try and do it. And if we keep doing that with each other, I think this journey will continue to unfold in this absolutely extraordinary way. Because far from it being something, I don't see it like nihilistically, or it's not like an irrelevancy or an appearance. This is it. You are real. Your individuality is as real as it gets. The oneness, which is real, has arisen as you, which is real, and you are that oneness in relationship with itself, which is real. And it's come from a level in which it's just formless, which is real, to a level where it's the whole enormous universe, which is real. And you are relating to that and doing your best to make the most of it. And we need to help each other do that.
All right. Well, we only got about 5 minutes left. I got 3 questions I think are really good that I'm picking out of the lot.
Thanks to everyone who put in a question. It's a real, it's always an honor when people ask questions to engage. It's a really lovely thing to do.
I feel tossed which one. One's about the fear of death. One's about, is this acausal? I know Richard has said this is acausal. I don't know what Tim's thoughts on that cause and effect are. And the other one was, if this is perfect and whole and complete, why is my life such a mess? I don't know if we can get, well, maybe can we do a rapid fire and hit all 3?
If you wanted to do the acausal one, my contribution to that will take about 4 seconds. I don't know about Tim. We could do that one if you like, and then move on to one of the others.
Great.
Is it a cool, what, I presume by it we mean the seeing that's being talked about here. Is it acausal? Yes.
Yeah, the shift, let's say. Yeah.
Oh, is the shift happens acausally? No, I think everything is the interaction of the one with itself, and every shift is coming through that interaction. I think it's a multi-level causality in which the very ground of things in physics and right up to the psyche are all interacting with each other, and that what causes the shift often is unknown, but actually in most situations that I see, you can trace it to somebody having read a book, maybe not at the time, it was a month later, a year later, someone having listened to somebody talk, somebody having heard it usually over and over and over again without really getting it, and then suddenly, bang, it will just fall into place. And then, like happened to me with the I'm Not a Person, that profound experience for me that we started with, suddenly you shift and then you're experiencing reality from a different perspective because you're ideating it in a new way, and that dramatic shift has a huge effect.
All right, next one. Do you fear death? What do you think happens when you die?
I'll take that one again. It might not take me very long. I'd just say that, what happens at death is unknowable, and rather obviously so. But because obviously death appears to be highly problematic, we are very good at creating extremely multifarious and complicated and complex stories about it, but it's unknowable.
I'm not sure it's unknowable any more than a lot of other things which are very difficult to know that we've managed to penetrate into, like the foundations of matter are pretty far out from our perspective, but we've been able to penetrate them and to show that we have by getting on the internet and having Zooms and all the things that it's made possible. So my current speculation would be that that the experience people have had around death. I worked with people who were dying for a period of my life. I've been around death a lot. I've studied near-death experiences in some great detail. So it looks to me like what happens, too big to explain how I justify this, is that the experience you're having right now of two realms or two types of experience, that you're experiencing sensations on the one hand, and you're also experiencing the psyche or the soul, which is an imaginal domain. You're imagining talking to yourself, you dream at night, all the visions you might have in psychedelics or shamanic practices, anything. There's a huge domain of the imaginal which you can explore. And it looks like what happens is that when the psychobiological system fails biologically, it's able to carry on and function in the psyche. So that level of reality that you're in right now seems to continue and go deeper.
All right. And the last one says, yeah, if this is perfect, whole, and complete and unconditional loving, why is my life such a mess? Either one of you can take that. That'll be
I took the last two first, so I'll leave that.
Okay, and I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to do it. I just didn't want to be impolite because I spoke last. I don't think it is whole and complete or perfect, or I think it's evolving. And that's why. It's because you can see it could be better. And that I can see it could be better is one of the impetuses that we make it better, that we make it better for ourselves, for our children, for the whole evolutionary process.
Okay, yeah, I can't quite remember the terms that were offered at the start of the question, if it's this, that, and the other, but I don't think I've ever used those terms. So I haven't said that. Why is your life? What was the phrase he used about his life, he or she?
They said that if this is whole and complete and perfect, why is my life such a mess?
Right.
Mess.
I mean, I don't know, other than to say that most of our lives are a mess, at least some of the time, and for some of us a lot of the time, and unfortunately for a few of us all the time. And this is a question where, to be honest, if it came up in a in-person meeting or whatever, I would probably step outside the bounds of strict non-duality communication. I mean, I have done this. These are the sorts of questions that come up, and I would suggest that maybe if you are experiencing your life as a mess, there are some practical things that maybe could be done about those, and what those practical things are. I mean, a sort of sophisticated audience that's watching this and so would probably already know what many or most of those are. But it's like, if it's something like that and there's an impulse to take action, then take action. That would be the sort of sensible thing to do. Whether it's see a therapist or go for a walk in the woods, or da, da, da. I know that sounds a bit banal because we're short of time. I don't mean it to sound banal. It's just that on that level, talking on that level, there are things hopefully that we can do. Places and people from whom we can find support. Yeah.
You wouldn't say it's whole and complete, or you just don't use that phrase? I mean, do you agree
I'm
with
not saying it isn't. I just don't
Okay.
use that phrase. It's not a phrase that I sort of rifling through what I laughingly call my sort of lamentable memory. I don't think that's the sort of phrase I'd use. No.
Okay.
But I mean, I've got no objection to it. That's the terms of the question.
I think that's what I hear.
Andreas, I do want to comment on this because I just thought about what the implication of this may be. I suppose I realise I can't actually answer that question unless I know what this is. So if I assume that by this we mean the everyday and so forth. Well, no, I certainly wouldn't describe it as like this, as like that. I mean, fairly self-evidently, there's kind of pretty big problems.
This is an expression of that, you said. This is an expression of unconditional love, you said earlier.
I might well have said it's an expression of it, yeah, but it's fairly obvious that that expression embraces everything, including, as I've said before, dog shit. Yeah. And shit happening in our lives as well, of course.
Well, I want to thank you both for being here. I want to thank everyone watching on YouTube and everyone that sent in questions. Again, we'll hold up these two. I'll give you another opportunity to say whatever you want, and then we will say goodbye. So, Tim, why don't you go first to remind people where to find you and what you got coming up?
You can find me by just Googling Tim Freke, Freke, because it's such a weird name. You'll find me. And there's loads of stuff and videos, and there's a retreat coming up that I mentioned. There's a meeting, a community that meet up and discuss these things and have experiential mainly every Sunday night. But so that's that. And I want to say thank you to you, Walter, for holding us here and for everyone who turned up. But I also want to say a big thank you to Richard, because I remember the last time, I think that we might have been one of the last times, was way back, was I was on a stage with Tony. And I was really hoping that I could have this conversation with Tony. And I was with Tony Parsons. And I was really surprised, because he always struck me as very playful. And was that he just wasn't up for it. He just wasn't up for playing. And it was like, we weren't going to get into it. And it was like, oh, that's a shame. It'd been really interesting to really try and work this out. So I just wanted to say thank you for being up to have the conversation and for being up for the level of questioning that we've engaged in. It doesn't always happen.
And for me, yes, rather than reminding you of when and where I may be speaking in person or on Zoom, just go to my website or sign up to my meetup group or something like that. Find me on Google. I haven't been doing Zoom meetings for a very long time, but it's possible that they may be starting again in the new year if you're interested. The main thing, however, is read that damn book. Read Confessions of a Secret, because if nothing else, you should get a few laughs out of it. And who knows, you might come out of it understanding what consciousness is or isn't and why there's no free will, possibly or not. And apart from that, again, yes, big thanks to everybody. Tim for being up for this. I still think it's a shame we didn't have a video camera at the original event, but I think this has sort of run it a fairly close second. So thank you, Tim. Thank you, Walter, for offering to do this and possibly not knowing what it was you were getting into. And thank you for everybody who's been watching. I hope you enjoyed at least some of it, at some part of it.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Appreciate your time. Take care. Bye, everybody.